So here we are. Hi everybody. Zoya's there. Zoya's there already. Hi everybody. Yes, we're back with another show this week as usual. But it's not Joe and Neil. It's Joe and Sergey. Well, actually, we do have Neil.
Hello.
We do have Neil's spirit animal down the back there. I don't know if you can see Neil's spirit animal. It's over there. That's Neil's spirit animal. So we will have the spirit of Neil with us this week. So you can expect some scintillating insights as a result of Neil's spirit animal. Anyway, my special guest for 1 week only, live, is Sergey. He's Sergey's. Are you Ukrainian?
Well, not really.
What if I asked you where you're from, what would you say?
Crimea.
You're Crimean,
Crimea, Russia.
right? But technically, you were born in Crimea,
Yeah.
and that wasn't part of Russia though when you were born. So you were born in Ukraine.
Yes.
I'm sorry to just burst your bubble there, but
I was born in the Soviet Union.
okay, born
technically speaking.
technically in the Soviet Union, but okay, right? So you're okay. You're born in the Soviet Union, but then at some point when you're growing up, after 1991,
Mhm.
you actually became a Ukrainian citizen, right?
Right.
And that wasn't until 2014, until you became a Russian citizen. Then technically,
No.
why?
I still have German Ukrainian citizenship.
Okay, but you live in Germany. You live in Germany. That's the thing.
Right.
But technically, you can also be a Russian citizen, or you are a Russian citizen in a certain sense. So you have three: German, Ukrainian, and Russian.
No, just two. German and Ukrainian?
But you can have Russian.
No.
You can't have Russian.
It's not allowed.
Really?
Double citizenship is not allowed neither in Germany, nor in Ukraine, nor in Russia.
Ah, okay.
And I got the second citizenship, the German one, only as an exception.
Okay.
Because Crimea at that time was occupied
Right. Okay.
by Russia.
In post 2014.
Right.
Yeah. But so if you wanted, you could have Russian citizenship
Yes.
if you chose. Anyway, yeah. Well, so the reason Sergey's a friend of ours, and I just wanted to, ask him a few questions, basically about, given that he was, okay, let's call it Ukraine. It was Soviet Union, but we'll call it Ukraine. It was still Ukraine then as well, I suppose. You're born in Ukraine. You grew up in Ukraine. When did you leave? What age?
When I was 25, like
Okay.
15 years ago.
Okay, so the first 25 years of your life, you were in Crimea,
Right.
and you never spent any time in Ukraine proper. I heard it.
Well, I visited a couple of cities
Right.
like Kiev, Kharkiv.
Okay.
I have some relatives
Right.
there, but I never lived there.
Right, and even when you were growing up in Crimea, did you? So say when you were 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, around that time when you were kind of like starting to become aware, let's say, of what was going on around you, were you aware that people in Crimea felt differently, or felt maybe separate or different in some way from people in the rest of Ukraine, or did you see yourself as, like in your case, in your family's case, did you see yourselves as just part of one big happy Ukrainian family?
No.
No? Never.
Well, for me, Crimea has always been Russian.
Right.
Because, Russian is my mother tongue.
Right.
Russian is mother tongue of my parents and my grandparents.
Right. And you think the language has that much effect in that sense? If the language you speak really kind of follows closely with kind of national identity or identity as
National mentality.
national mentality. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
Language and religion.
Right. But a lot of people in in Ukraine proper also speak Russian,
Yes.
but also speak a bit of both. Or we did statistics one time on a show quite a while ago, and I can't remember the exact details, but it was a high percentage of the population of Ukraine, like actual Ukrainians, who spoke Russian, who said that they spoke Russian either partly or most of the time or some of the time. So for a lot of people in Ukraine, it's a language, a first language or second language or a dual language, basically.
Yes. It's, well, many people in Ukraine can speak both,
Right.
Russian and Ukrainian.
Right.
But it's either the first language or the second language.
Right.
And I had to learn Ukrainian from the first grade at school.
Right.
So I kind of know both,
Right.
but Russian is my mother tongue.
Right. So you You went to Ukrainian language classes in school?
Yes, it was obligatory
Right.
in
but,
the 90s.
But not Russian, obviously, because Russian was
Russian as
was your
well.
first language. Or you went to, but you know what I mean? Language classes in the sense of teaching you how to speak the language. You had to learn the language, but you learned the Russian at home, right?
Well, Russian literature, Russian grammar, and so on.
Yeah, but you're from your parents and family. You spoke
Yeah,
Russian all the
sure.
time, so that you wouldn't have gone to classes for those because you knew that fluently because you're a native speaker essentially. But Ukrainian, you had to kind of learn in a certain sense.
Right.
Okay. So what was the attitude of people in? Would you say most people in Crimea didn't, for as long as you've been alive anyway, didn't see themselves as part of Ukrainian. They saw themselves as more Russian, living in a part of Ukraine.
No, not the people I know of. The only person who I knew during these 25 years who lived in Crimea and spoke Ukrainian was my teacher of Ukrainian language.
Okay.
I heard occasionally Ukrainian language in summer when some tourists were coming from Ukraine, but that's all. Nobody spoke Ukrainian in Crimea,
Right.
at least in the 90s.
And just the question I was wondering about is your impression is that most of the population of Crimea, to your understanding, saw themselves as Russian first.
Right.
Not they just happen to be living in a part of Ukraine, but one day to be reunited with the motherland type thing
Right.
or something like that, right?
Because culturally, traditionally, language-wise, it has always been Russian.
Right. Okay. So what about in Ukraine itself then? I know you can't speak for it, but you have family members living in Ukraine right now, right?
Yeah.
And what's your impression? Let's say, I'm not saying this is going to be the objective truth, whatever, but it's important because it's your perspective. Since you've lived there, you were born there. What's your perspective on the attitude of before, let's say February this year, or let's say even before 2014? What was the attitude of the average Ukrainian towards Russia?
Well, I can speak only for my friends and relatives.
Right.
But before 2014, the question about who you are, Ukrainian or Russian, it wasn't an issue at all.
Okay.
If your mother tongue is Russian, you are more or less Russian.
Okay.
But after 2014, and some of my close relatives just fell for Ukrainian propaganda.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Ukrainian propaganda was creating at that time this new Ukrainian identity.
Right. A new separate Ukrainian identity that didn't
Right.
exist before
Yeah.
in that way.
Yeah. And many people suddenly decided they're not Russian anymore, but Ukrainian.
Right.
Because whatever reason.
Because they were told so, or because nationalism was stoked in them.
Yeah,
or,
it's a combination of historical ignorance
Right.
and propaganda.
Right.
Ukrainian propaganda.
Right. And I mean, I might as well ask you. Well, actually, let me ask you about Euromaidan. What was your response to the events in 2014 when you had basically the protests in Kiev primarily, I think, and then a coup, essentially, overthrowing of the democratically elected government in favor of a different government that was, by all accounts or by all the evidence was, put in place by, at least with the help of America. What was your response to those events? How did you view them from the perspective that this was a coup kind of thing?
Sure. Knowing the history of all these color revolutions, and
Right.
there was already Orange Revolution
Right.
in Ukraine,
Previous
2004.
Yeah.
It was very scary, saddening, and disheartening to
Right.
see. And
And your parents live in Crimea?
yeah, still.
What did they think of it, of Euromaidan?
Well, they were happy that Yanukovych had to flee.
They were happy?
They were happy.
Why was that?
Well, it's kind of complicated because Yanukovych himself, he wasn't an ideal president.
Right.
He was pro-Russian.
Right.
There was peace. I mean, but Yanukovych himself, he was considered by many people, regardless, pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, as just another oligarch.
Right.
You know?
Corrupt, yeah.
Yeah, corruption.
Yeah.
And I had an impression at the very beginning of Maidan protests that some people were genuinely protesting against all of this corruption. Yeah?
Right. Okay.
But at some turning point, you remember all these
Mhm.
shootings,
Yes.
snipers. It became violent,
Right.
and then there was no
Hmm. But there
coming
wasn't.
back.
Yeah. So, I mean, was there anything particularly corrupt about Yanukovych compared to someone else? Because I mean, my impression of Ukrainian politics is that it's quite corrupt. You know, not that most other politics are corrupt as well, but the Ukrainian politics going back to 2004 when there was an orange revolution and stuff.
Mhm.
That was
Yushchenko,
Yushchenko,
Mhm.
and then you have what do you call her, Timoshenko, the
Timoshenko.
woman and stuff. That all
Prime
those people were
Minister.
quite corrupt. None of them had any, honourable intentions in trying to
True, yeah.
to get into power, right?
Mhm.
So Ukrainians have lived with a series of more or less corrupt governments
From the very beginning.
from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So the idea that anybody would focus on Yanukovych, and he must be removed because he's, really much worse than any others. I don't know if I don't think that's necessarily true, and certainly when you had, ultimately he was replaced by Poroshenko. He was replaced by what do you call him, Yatsenyuk first, and then Poroshenko, and. But I mean, Poroshenko. It seems it's just a continuation. Like Poroshenko was kind of ousted because he was removed. Okay, he lost against Zelensky. I think he was running against Zelensky, right? But Poroshenko's inured in, or he's mired in lots of corruption scandals and all that kind of stuff. And Zelensky's government wanted to prosecute him for treason.
Well, they did, I guess.
They did prosecute him for treason. So
Not for treason, but for collaboration with Russia.
right. So my point here, I suppose, is that in 2014, in the coup, the US-backed coup that helped to get rid of Yanukovych, that wasn't ushering in some glorious era of democracy and freedom and wonderfully benevolent and uncorrupt government. It didn't change anything. In that
There was
respect.
just this general resentment and tiredness
Right.
of all the politicians.
Okay.
All the politicians, all the oligarchs, and there was nothing specific about how corrupt
Right.
Yanukovych was.
It was just a general
Resentment.
discontent with the state of politics in general.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but did your parents at the time living in Crimea, did they understand that to be a US-backed coup in 2014?
No, I don't think so.
That was pretty.
It wasn't presented this way in
No,
Ukrainian
of course
media.
not. Yeah. Coups generally aren't, especially by the Americans or by the media in the West. Okay, so. But your parents, although see themselves as Russian, living in Crimea,
Yeah, they have Russian citizens.
right? And what's their perspective on Russia's special military operation right now, over the past 6 months?
Well, right now, they had a strongly negative opinion of Putin before. I mean, after 2014.
Okay,
But after the start of the war, of this special military operation, it became polarized even more.
right,
So, and they still have their relatives in Ukraine,
right,
Kiev, Kharkiv.
right. So
And-
they, would you say that a lot of people in Crimea, or most people in Crimea, don't agree with the special military operation,
No, it's
particularly your parents?
Yeah, no, it's an exception because I have other friends in Crimea,
Right,
and they all agree that it's necessary.
it's necessary. Okay,
And some of them even lost their jobs
Right.
because of all the sanctions
right,
imposed by the West.
yeah.
But they still support Putin and this special military operation.
Okay, and you have a family member living in Ukraine as well, right?
Yeah, several.
Several family members living in Ukraine. What's their perspective on what's going on? If they're living in Ukraine, I suppose they're a bit more directly in the line of fire, so they're maybe more inclined to be not happy with the situation. I mean,
Well, they are not happy with the situation because nobody knows what comes tomorrow.
right, yeah.
But
So your other family members, I suppose your siblings, right? Siblings?
yeah,
Are they? Would they tend to be pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian?
pro-Ukrainian.
Okay. And do you think that's a function of them living in Ukraine as opposed to Crimea?
living in Ukraine and consuming Ukrainian media.
Media and
Yeah.
propaganda. Okay. Very interesting.
Because I have to say that, especially after the beginning of this special military operation, Ukrainian people live in a kind of information bubble.
Right.
They prohibited 11 parties in the last months and several
11 political parties.
political parties.
Like Zelensky banned them.
Right.
Right.
Oppositional pro-Russian parties, they were prohibited.
Right.
And it has been happening over the years, but I mean, several pro-Russian journalists living in Ukraine have been even killed
Right.
or suicided.
Right.
But after the February this year, it's became even worse. I mean, even against Poroshenko,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
all these criminal charges, Poroshenko and Kolomoisky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The big Jewish banker dude.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they cannot even have peace
Are you allowed to
between themselves. You know.
Right, yeah, yeah. No honor among thieves. Yeah, it's pretty bad, the state of politics in the whole world, I suppose, extremely corrupt, but especially in the Western countries, and anything Western countries touch or have an involvement in, it seems to spread as a kind of like just corruption and money grabbing in politics, you know. So, what is your understanding of the? Just so we understand, get clear what you're thinking on it is. What's your understanding of the cause of the conflict that Russia is calling its anti-terrorist operation?
Well,
Or sorry, not anti-terrorist operation. What is your understanding of the cause of the conflict that started in 2014, that Kiev started calling an anti-terrorist operation against the Donbass? What's the source of that from your understanding?
well, this conflict has a long history and long roots. It's all started mostly during Bolshevik time,
Right.
1920s,
So
1930s.
100 years ago.
Yeah. All this process of Ukrainization.
Right.
Because before Bolsheviks basically created Ukraine from the fragments of the Russian Empire.
Okay.
And after that, it has become Ukraine.
Uh-huh.
And Ukraine basically means Ukraina. And Ukraina, it's in Russian. And Ukraina means periphery.
Periphery. Okay.
It was periphery of Russia.
of the Russian Empire.
Right. And Ukrainians, if you translate it into English, it basically means frontier guards. Ukrainians are people who lived on the periphery of Russia, protecting her borders,
Protecting who?
its borders.
Its borders. Okay. Okay. So border guards.
Right.
So Ukraine and Ukrainians basically means the border guards on the frontier.
Right.
Uh-huh. It's interesting.
And I mean, Bolsheviks started this process of Ukrainization just to win over some national elites.
Right.
And if you have some local national elites, they thought it would help to avoid some separatist
Right.
tendencies, you know,
Right.
and make them look great
Mm-hmm.
in the eyes of the international community.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the reason for this Ukrainization. Yeah.
Okay.
So people who considered themselves Russians suddenly had to learn
Okay.
Ukrainian literature,
Mm-hmm.
and so it was beginning of this Ukrainian fake identity, as I call it.
Okay. So, from your perspective, historically, the Ukrainian identity was manufactured.
It was
Starting
manufactured.
about 100 years ago with the actual borders and stuff for the area of Ukraine, and then the
Right.
identity, etc. And I suppose that took with some people, but it didn't take with others, because basically what you're saying is the people who are in Ukraine today have always been Russian, effectively,
Yeah, yeah,
and they still are today.
yeah.
And there's just been a Ukrainian identity has been was forced on them, or not forced, but adopted by them, or starting about 100 years ago and progressively since then, and it developed progressively since then. But within that grouping of people in the borders of modern day Ukraine, you had a lot of people who didn't really take that Ukrainian identity. They kept their historical Russian identity.
Right.
And for some reason they're in the east. They're concentrated in the east. Is that the case? Because that's what I'm talking about here in terms of the conflict that Kiev started against the people in Donbass in the east of the country in 2014 after the US-backed coup.
Mhm.
It was people in the east who all decided we don't want anything to do with this new government that's kind of anti-Russian and anti the Russian language and pro-Western, and they wanted to kind of just leave basically, but take their land with them, right? They didn't want to leave their land, but they didn't want to be a part of this new Ukraine
Yeah.
post 2014.
They have always been closer to Russia, traditionally, culturally,
Right.
because they're basically on the border with Russia.
Right. Okay.
And
Yeah, so it is very simplistic in that sense, east-west split, where you have in the west, they're beside Poland,
Right.
they have more influences from Western Europe, and in the east, they have more influences from Russia.
and all these Maidan protests, I guess it took several months for all of them to unfold.
Right.
And they of course saw everything that was happening in Kiev,
Yeah.
and they have their own peaceful protests.
Mm-hmm.
There was no violence before the start of this anti-terrorist operation,
By Kiev, yeah.
with a few exceptions. But
So the violence, Kiev started acting violently, basically, towards the people in the east of Ukraine and the
Yeah,
Donbass,
yeah.
because they were
they
kind
were
of
afraid.
protesting about.
Yeah,
well,
they were afraid of these separatist tendencies.
They knew it was there
Yeah,
already,
yeah.
which is, in a certain sense, invalidates their claim to, keeping these people, or these people are, being, they're Russian, they're like influenced by Russia, or Russia's manipulating them, or Russia's encouraging separatism in eastern Ukraine. I don't think, maybe Russia is, or was to some extent, but they didn't have to try very hard, because people in eastern Ukraine were already historically pro-Russian.
Right.
The whole situation is bizarre to me, because there have been plenty of conflicts like that around the world over the course of the 20th century, where the international community or the UN or whatever recognized, different national identities, or different ethnic or national identities, even religious identities, and it was always argued that the people who felt different should have a right to, if it came to it, and if they're willing to really, if they're willing to take up arms and fight for it, it's better not to go to war with them, but let them go where they want to go, or create their own little country, or go to another country, or whatever. I mean, it's happened many, many times, and it's always a source of, it has always been seen as something that is wrong to try and violently, for a government to try and violently oppress a group within a country that has a separate identity and a valid separate identity, and that they want to leave. And if they're being oppressed, I mean, you look at Europe, and what most countries, if you look at Europe in terms of, like I was just going to say there, in terms of like the Basque Country as one example. In Europe, obviously, with Kosovo later and stuff, but the Basque Country has been going on for quite a long time in Spain, northern Spain, and even other regions in Spain as well. The Spanish government always has extended, after there was conflict in the Basque Country for quite a long time, in the kind of 70s, 80s and 90s, but even as a result of that, or even before that, the Spanish government had extended kind of certain levels of autonomy, because they saw themselves as different, because of the language. Let's say that the Basque language, they wanted to have Basque language taught in schools to be their national language, culture, et cetera, and have control over their own finances to a large extent, so they could run their own little country. And most, at least Western European or Western countries, have always advocated for the rights of those people, and even not just advocated for the rights of those people, but even within their own countries, allowed those people to have a significant amount of autonomy. Yet that doesn't seem to be being applied. It was never brought up really publicly. There were no Western media, newspaper articles, or whatever, or editorials written about the plight of the people in Donbass and how they, because obviously after 2014 in particular, the Kiev government wanted to ban Russian, make Russian basically, make Ukrainian the only official language in Russia, and ban the speaking of Russia, ban the speaking of Russian, ban the teaching of Russian in schools and stuff.
Well, it was happening before.
Yeah, for sure.
This continuation of prohibition of Russian language, Russian culture,
right,
and this obligation to learn Ukrainian at schools everywhere.
Yeah,
all the exams for several years now in Ukraine should be taken in Ukrainian.
Okay.
So
For me, that's the way. It's interesting to hear you say it because for me, that's the problem in eastern Ukraine, and this all started in 2014. Like what people are talking about, ignorantly talking about today on social media and in the vast majority of the Western press, what they're ignorantly talking about in terms of the conflict today in Ukraine, it at least started in 2014. Like obviously we can go back further, like you mentioned
right,
stuff, but
right.
at least started in 2014 in terms of there being a coup in the country. No one agrees that a coup is a good idea. Sometimes people say, well, it is good if you're getting rid of a corrupt government, but that doesn't seem to be the case. You might have been getting rid of a corrupt government in the form of uh,
Elections.
Yanukovych. Yeah. Well, you should do it in terms of elections. Yeah, it shouldn't be a violent overthrow, which it was. So you had a significant percentage of the population in the east of Ukraine who said, listen, we don't like the look of this undemocratic coup. And we don't want to be anything to do with, we don't want to have anything to do with the government that's imposed afterwards. And it seems to have been imposed by the West. But instead of saying to those people who have a legitimate separate sense, a sense of separate identity and their affiliation with the Russian language, instead of the government in Kiev saying, okay, and doing what European governments would have done, like, for example, the Spanish and the Basque country, okay, you can have lots of autonomy, speak your own language, have your own education system, have mostly control over your own finances and your tax collection and all that kind of stuff. They could have and should have done that if they used this European model, but instead the West just fell silent as Kiev started to bomb them. And
Well, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because, I mean, it's a part of Russophobia and all the double standards
right.
applied to Russians and to Russia, and it's just one aspect of it.
Right. And of course, you would have to put it in the context of a broader geopolitical machinations that, between East and West, and particularly between the USA and Russia, and Russia's, because that is the context in which all of this has been happening, where America sees itself as being threatened by at least two, let's say, peer competitors,
Mm-hmm.
maybe primarily right now Russia, but also Russia and China, which is why you hear them complaining about Russia and China all the time, and that Russia and China could stand in opposition to American hegemony in the world, and the American, the Washington elite have a problem with that. They want to remain the hegemon for as long as possible, so anything they can do to keep Russia and or China down and stop them gaining more control over resources and, influence in the rest of the world, they do that. So in that sense, it makes sense that's why they didn't care about the plight of the people, the poor people in Donbass, right? There was no humanitarian intervention or humanitarian relief for them, because keep taking all of Ukraine away from Russia and into the Western sphere fits with American geopolitical objectives in terms of trying to stop Russia at all, anywhere and everywhere. And this is another aspect that people don't understand when they talk about this. I mean,
Yeah, it has always been about Russia.
Yeah.
Russia was the target from the very beginning.
Right.
And Ukraine is just a proxy,
A tool.
to achieve it.
Right.
And many Ukrainians just don't realize it
Yeah.
because of the ignorance.
Well, most people in the West have no clue whatsoever. They're
Yeah.
completely ignorant of any of this, which is weird. Like, because we were talking about this earlier on. It's like, the narrative seems to be in the West, and there's so many. I don't know if they're real people on Twitter or not, because they're so stupid. I think they must be some kind of like really low grade bot or something that doesn't have a lot of AI or whatever. But I can't believe this stuff. But I know some of them are real people. Some of them are politicians and fairly supposedly intelligent people, and the narrative they put out there, I don't know if they believe that narrative or not. If they believe it, it's terrible, because they're extremely ignorant people. If they don't believe it, they're deliberately spreading propaganda, which they think is probably justified because they're fighting their fight against Russia, right? So they can tell all sorts of lies. But the level of discourse that they try and encourage other people, ordinary people, to engage in is abysmal. It's like, Russia, bad. That's it, pretty much. Russia, bad. No, well, wait, why did Russia invade Ukraine? Putin, bad. Well, but what do you mean? A bit more complex. Can we have a little bit more complexity? Okay, Putin want more land. Putin imperialist want more land. And like you said to me in response to that, the president of the largest country in the world with the most land mass wants an extra bit of Ukraine just for shits and giggles, because he's addicted to land, right? He wants some more, which is ridiculous. So it's that level of ignorance, in terms of the narrative that people have about why this is actually happening. And I always like to think that people want to know why something's really happening. What's the context around this? What are the real motivations of different people in this conflict? But apparently, most people aren't interested.
Well, very few people are really interested because
But why? If they have comment, they comment on it.
okay.
They comment on it, but they don't want to know. They don't want to give an actual, an accurate or truthful or a more nuanced comment
Well, maybe they just parroting mass media,
because they're
mainstream
stupid.
media.
Because they're idiots. I mean, that's the definition of an idiot for me. Someone who just spouts off on Twitter with an inane bullshit, obviously, even to the average person, a stupid argument, an argument that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, or a narrative that is just so unlikely to be true. My dog understands that it's a bullshit narrative, but these people just spout it off. And that's what I'm going to blow up Twitter or something. Oh, maybe I shouldn't blow up things. Anyway, it's bizarre. Yeah. So the context obviously is important, and obviously Putin they don't even have to be pro-Russian. They can just try and think, well, probably Putin, if you want to call it Putin, but the Russian government, let's say, had motivation, a reason to launch their special military operation in Ukraine that wasn't limited to either Putin bad or want more land. There's probably a bit more involved in that. I wonder what it was. Let me think about it. Let me research a little bit. Let me figure it out. And then but the Western media doesn't want you to do that. It doesn't want ordinary people to do that. Because then the Western media's banal, inane narratives will be seen by the average person as ridiculous. It'll be more proof that the Western media is just a propaganda outlet for Western governments,
Well, I can imagine that some people in the West can see through all these narratives.
Right.
I mean, I live in Germany, and I have several German friends.
Right.
They are a bit elderly,
Mm-hmm.
but they know perfectly well what's happening in Ukraine.
So they're not fooled by the propaganda.
Right, but they're just afraid to speak.
Right.
They're afraid to speak, to be labeled as conspiracy theorist.
Right. Yeah.
In
Horrible.
Germany,
Terrible thing.
In
Yeah.
Germany, I'm a member of German-Russian Society.
Right.
It's a small society in a middle-sized town,
Mm-hmm.
and they used to have cultural relationship with Irkutsk in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the elderly Germans, they're all Germans there. Some of them studied Russian,
What Russian?
Russian language.
Okay, started Russian, yeah.
Right. And some of them have even friends in Donbass,
Okay.
and they're still in touch.
Okay.
And they know perfectly well what's happening in Donbass.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of, it's an organization, and they just don't want to make any public statements about it. Officially, they condemn Russia for what's happening in Ukraine.
Right.
But if you meet together,
Yeah.
and they speak truth
Right.
as it is.
Yeah, maybe our problem is we have too much freedom to just say what the truth is, basically, Ordinary people out there in society can't just go around saying the truth, pointing out the elephant in the room, or calling a spade a spade. They can't do that. They have to be careful. I suppose that was a big part of the whole COVID business as well. You know what I mean? That was.
Yeah.
There seems to be a process there, not limited to COVID. Go back past COVID, of people, especially around politics or immigration, all this kind of stuff. Social issues. People have become aware that they have to be increasingly careful about what they actually say, even if it's the truth. In fact, you have to be extremely careful,
Right.
extra careful, if what you're saying happens to be the truth of a certain situation. Yeah, it's not good. So I suppose more recent, staying with Ukraine or whatever. Well, I mean, are your family and friends in Ukraine, they're in the east, are they, or kind of out of they're not in the conflict zone, right?
Well, some of them are, and
Oh, yeah?
they all on the Ukrainian controlled territory.
Okay,
So it's kind of back and forth
Mhm.
security ways.
right. It's changeable.
Yeah,
Yeah, it can't be good to live in that situation. You know what I mean? It's very
it's very stressful.
stressful.
You never know what comes tomorrow.
Right, the uncertainty. Yeah, but your parents are okay in Crimea so far, anyway.
Yeah, they safe.
Yeah. Yeah. I won't ask you for any predictions about where it's going to go. Then, no. What the eventual outcome is going to be. Do you have any strong beliefs or strong convictions about the eventual outcome?
Well, I guess we just have wait and see what comes this winter. I mean, with all these possible energy shortages in Germany and Europe in general.
Right. So you're saying the impact on Europe, let's say first and foremost, of energy shortages might make them less
Willing to support Ukraine.
right or less able to support Ukraine. Yeah.
Because actually, I'm not sure whether you know it, but Ukraine has been connected to the European energy grid.
right, they supply electricity to Europe, right?
Yeah, and they wanted to increase it,
Right.
and
Ukraine said no.
no, Ukraine wanted to increase export of energy
Right.
to Europe,
Yeah.
and a couple of days later, Russians blew off several of thermal energy plants.
So not enough electricity for Europe anymore.
And what the most bizarre is, I don't know, you remember this Zaporizhia
Yeah. The power
nuclear power plant,
Mhm.
and this plant supplied before 20% of all the energy.
in
It's
Ukraine.
right. It's the biggest one in Europe with 6 reactors.
Right.
And what Ukrainian military has been doing for the last months, they were shelling it. They still do.
Right.
And not only that, they separated, they destroyed all the outgoing energy lines from this power plant to Ukraine.
The Ukrainians did.
Yeah. So they deliberately cut themselves off this plant.
From that plant. Why?
Well, never knows. Who knows? I don't understand it. I don't understand it at all. Maybe to increase more suffering, to put blame on Russia
Right.
anyway.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. Russia's denying electricity. Well, that's a big part of it, like is carrying out attacks yourself and then blaming it on your enemy.
Yeah.
Those are called false flag attacks, and we learned from earlier on this year, actually as part of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we learned about that they're actually real from the Pentagon. Actually, the
Right.
Pentagon deputy spokesman said that.
But yeah, what I wanted to say that Ukrainian government doesn't give a shit about Ukrainian people.
Right. That's often the case in terms of, especially in Western countries, the relationship between government and people.
They are ready to get themselves cut off 20%
Mm-hmm.
of this energy, possibly just to blame Russia.
Right. Yeah, they're willing to sacrifice as many Ukrainians as necessary
Yeah.
in order to blame Russia. Yeah. Yeah. So, well, just yesterday morning, I think early in the morning, whatever. There was a the bridge between
6 a.m.
6
local
a.m.
time.
Over the Kerch Strait, which joins Crimea to
Krasnodar region.
Russia. Yeah, a truck bomb, exploded. Let me see. I think, do I have? Yeah, I probably do. Well, you've probably seen plenty of video. It wasn't that bad. There's the specific the actual video of a truck. I'm sure people have seen it. We don't necessarily need to play it, but there's a truck driving along. It's still dark, but 6 a.m. explodes basically. And the story is that it was full of fertilizer. It was on the bridge. 4 lanes basically separated, two and two separated from each other. It was driving from the Russian region of Krasnodar towards Crimea in that direction, and it exploded. Fertilizer bomb, ammonium nitrate, I suppose, damaged the track above. There's another part of the bridge above that carries a railway. I think this, if you just put that one up, Scotty, this is is that that video? I think it is, yeah. This is a video showing it actually. Just play it there. That's the railway bridge to the left. This is one road, one part of the bridge the left. The fallen part is just on the right there. It kind of a section of it fell into the ocean, but they've just turned the dual lane highway into a double way basically, so cars can still continue on that section that's not broken. And above there, the railway line is it wasn't really damaged. There was a train passing by at the time. Well, actually, just mention that in a minute. I'm just looking here for where is that. That's the same one. There's I had a satellite picture of it. Well, I don't have it anymore. Well, that's Fintman. Yeah. Anyway, the point is, truck driving along. You've seen the video. Blows up. Somebody was driving the truck. A car driving alongside the truck was destroyed as well, and 2 people in it were killed. So the truck driver plus 2 people.
5 in total.
Five
now.
were killed now.
5 civilians.
So 5 civilians were killed. And clearly this was the Ukrainians, possibly with the help of their NATO friends, or whatever, Americans, who knows. But the truck was coming from the Krasnodar region, i.e. it entered the Crimean bridge towards Crimea from Russian territory. Who knows where, we don't know yet where it originated. I was thinking that maybe it came over the border from Georgia, further south or whatever, because, the US has more access to, I suppose, or the US and Ukrainians even maybe have more access to the, to what's needed basically to carry out that kind of an operation outside of Russian territory. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe they did do it just from originating inside Russia. Anyway, the truck obviously came through a section of Russia, maybe traveling for several hours through that southern Russian territory along the Black Sea, and then gets onto the Crimean bridge, and halfway along the Crimean bridge, someone detonates it. Now we have to assume that the guy who was driving the truck did not know.
Yes.
Otherwise,
it's very likely.
Otherwise, we're talking about a suicide bombing, right? Which
it's not very common.
Right, it's not so common. Well, you never know with Zelensky, I actually have a picture of the new leader of Ukraine here. His name is Osama. I think it's Osama bin Zelensky.
Ben Zelensky, right?
If it's the case that he's that this was a suicide bombing, and it was obviously the Ukrainian government was involved in it, then this is the new leader of Ukraine. He's going to be issuing videos talking about the American infidel or the Russian infidels. No, so we have to assume that it was somebody who didn't know. Some poor guy who was just part of a delivery. It was a truck driver, picked up a delivery of fertilizer, ammonium nitrate. Someone had stashed a bomb inside, a detonator inside it, and then were watching it and followed it. And you mentioned also the fact that train was going along on the track above at the time that someone pushed the button. Suggests a detailed knowledge of, at least of those train times and a planning of the whole thing, so that you would do it at that particular time. I mean, the train caught on fire. The fuel that it was carrying caught on fire, but it didn't really damage the train tracks above, which I think was part of their agenda. I mean, the Ukrainians who did this, they wanted to try and disrupt transport and military supplies, basically,
right,
from over that strait, particularly train maybe, but also trucks. So they made an effort, and but they didn't achieve very much. They screwed it up, basically. Yeah. It wasn't very useful. And it suggests that that's the only option they really have for attacking that bridge. And they've talked about attacking that bridge previously, but the only real option they had was to get some poor guy who didn't know that he was carrying a bomb inside a fertilizer truck, and to blow it up and to kill, to risk and obviously kill 4 more civilians, they're saying now. So the truck driver and 4 more civilians. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the first time in this conflict that any of the warring parties, like i.e. Russia and Ukraine, at least, or Russia, Ukraine / NATO, have deliberately, knowingly killed civilians as part of a strategic move. Do you know what I mean? Lots of civilians have been killed, but at no time did, at least in terms of the truck driver was deliberately murdered, let's say, sacrificed, against his wishes, obviously, by the Ukrainian government to serve a Ukrainian government agenda. Otherwise, he was a suicide bomber. In which case, it's a whole new level of radicalism, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm not surprised. They did it before. I mean, with all the green Ukrainian soldiers used as cannon fodder.
Yeah, well, they're soldiers, right? But here we're talking about civilians. This is kind of like a moral thing in a certain sense,
Or maybe Ukrainian soldiers using civilians as
as
a shield.
shields.
As a shield.
That's that would even be grayer in a certain sense. But this guy was deliberately sacrificed. He was killed. Like, I mean, there was no question. They knew they were going to they were killed.
Right.
I mean, that's a level that, you know, they claim Russia's Putin's evil terrorist state, the Russian military are evil butchers, etc., etc. But this is the first time and the only time that anybody has deliberately killed a civilian in order to achieve, used a civilian instrumentally and sacrificed their lives against their wishes to achieve a supposed military objective. And in the end, they got nothing out of it because the road's back open and the railway is back open and the road's functioning and will be fixed relatively shortly.
Well, the first passenger train passed several hours later.
Yeah. So there wasn't much damage to the railway at all.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
was rather symbolical, just to annoy Russia
Right.
once more.
Yeah, and then, of course, Twitter, you know, Slava Ukraini Twitter erupted in glee. And it's bizarre again. I can't get, I do understand it, but it always surprises me. You might know this guy. His name's Alexander Vindman. He was a former national security advisor, and he. So anyway, this is a tweet. I'll tell you who he is in a minute. I've been dreaming of this moment, right? So this Vintman guy, I mean, I know his face because of the past few years of bullshit with Trump and all that kind of stuff. But he's a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel who's the Director of European Affairs for the United States National Security Council, the NSC. And he came to national attention in October 2019 when he testified before Congress regarding the Trump-Ukraine scandal. If you remember the Trump-Ukraine scandal, do you remember that? It was basically a big nothing burger. It was basically Trump trying to get Zelensky to investigate Biden and his son's corrupt dealings, which are, you know, everybody with any sense knows that Biden and his son Hunter and others have been involved in corrupt deals within Ukraine. So Trump tried to get Zelensky to say, listen, you should investigate Biden and his son and his dealings in your country because they're pretty dodgy. Pretty much, you'd think that would be okay, right? But apparently that's big no-no, and this guy testified against Trump because he's a diehard, you know, Dem, Washington deep state, you know, America's the best, evil Russia. That's his whole mentality, like so many others. And so that's who he is. That's his background. That's how he became kind of quote unquote famous over the past few years, or in 2019. But then he pops up posting, "I've been dreaming of this moment." Why would some idiot, like, you know what I mean? There's a level of investment in what's going on there that's very strange for someone like him. He's a very low level person. Okay, he was what was he called? He was a European Affairs. He was the Director for European Affairs for the NSC. I suppose that's relatively high level, but there's so many like him. You know what I mean? There's so many positions like that. You know, and they're all absolutely convinced of this manifest destiny kind of, you know, special purpose that America has to fight Russia and stop Russia. You know what I mean? And so any conflict that starts, suddenly they're like absolutely fully invested and fully involved in. Personally, he's been dreaming of it.
Well,
he loves it.
It's the right to protect
The right to protect what?
other nations from the evil Russians.
No,
To spread the democracy and to
really?
protect them from
Yeah.
any nationalistic tendencies.
Yeah. So it's, yeah, okay. America world police then? I mean, usually, yeah, I suppose you have to be invested in it to some extent, but that kind of stuff just, I don't want to get into someone like that's mind. You know, I don't want to understand his head because it's probably a pretty scary place. But, well, the other thing I wanted to mention, just, and since we brought it up, that's relevant here is, on this particular topic about Trump. Do you remember Michael Flynn? He's a retired U.S. Army general, lieutenant general, and he got in trouble. He was Trump's pick for national security advisor for Trump, but then he only was in the job for like 22 days or something before he was ousted effectively. But let's just listen to him here on, just as a reference, on, it's only 40, 50 seconds, on Ukraine.
So when you see Putin and a very interesting speech that was just given, I think, literally in the last couple of days by Medvedev, okay, the former. So Medvedev is another guy in the hierarchy. He was the president of Russia for a short period of time. Medvedev's speech was very stern, and so we have got to pay attention because these are not shy leaders. These are bold leaders who have everything at stake in terms of protecting their country. So these fools, and like I said about Zelensky and his statement about nuclear war, and people can go to the various Telegram and or my various social media to see it. That is a foolish person. But what's more dangerous than that is a dangerous fool, right?
So I mean, obviously doesn't like Zelensky, dangerous fool, and he said referred to the Russian political government hierarchy, whatever, bold leaders who have everything at stake in terms of protecting their country. Doesn't sound very much like the American position, right? So obviously he's the Slavo-Ukrainian people are not very happy with him, right? But then they have they shouldn't expect to be happy with him because he, like I said, he was nominated. He became Trump's national security advisor in January 2017. So just right off the bat, he was Trump's new national security advisor. But he got into trouble because he had on February 3rd. I'll just read here from the article. On February 13th, 2017, he resigned. So 22 days after he got the job, he resigned after information surfaced that he had misled Vice President Mike Pence and others about the nature and content of his communications with Russian ambassador to the US, Sergei Kislyak. So he had been talking to the Russian ambassador, and this is 2017, so this is around time fight against ISIS, etc. So the actual what he was accused of was not telling the right people or doing stuff on his own initiative in a certain sense, or on Trump's initiative, to talk to the Russian ambassador and to Lavrov and reveal or disclose sensitive information about ISIS in Syria. So basically, the short version is that this guy Michael Flynn, who was just expressing that opinion about Zelensky, he was, basically outed or booted or forced to resign from Trump's national security as Trump's national security advisor because he had been talking in those few short days. He had been talking to the Russian government, and probably with the agreement of Trump, obviously, or even at the instruction of Trump, to share information about ISIS, so both of them together could deal with ISIS in Syria, which was Trump's thing, right?
Right.
That was a big no-no, because America was, to one extent or another, using ISIS in Syria for their own agenda to try and overthrow the Syrian government or to try and take control of Syria. So he got booted. So basically, this guy who is now being hated for saying this about Ukraine was hated 3 years ago for trying to coordinate with Russia on defeating ISIS in Syria.
Which was allegedly the common goal.
Of course.
Of both US
officially
and
the
Russia.
officially the common goal.
Yeah.
And Trump took everything at face value. Said, "Okay, I'm the commander in chief. I make decisions. I'm going to make some decisions. We're fighting a war on terror. Okay, I'm going to get rid of the terrorists." And they were like, "No, you don't understand. That's not the way it works. That's just what we say. That's not what you do. Jesus, what's wrong with you?" So, and then everybody knows the history of what happened to Trump after that. But
I just wanted to mention
Yeah.
a small interesting detail.
mm-hmm,
In Germany,
mm-hmm,
yesterday, almost at the same time
yeah,
of this explosion on the
Mhm.
Crimean bridge, in the northern Germany,
mm-hmm.
train communication network has been disrupted for several hours.
Because of what?
because of sabotage,
Some kind of sabotage.
some kind of sabotage by unknown persons. So for several hours, several trains couldn't move.
Was that the Russians then? Is that what you're saying? Not only did the Russians blow up their own bridge, but they blew up the bridge in. Actually, I did find the. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the thing is, there's so much cloak and dagger stuff going on, and people, you know what I mean? I mean, we don't know. There's so much stuff being done by governments, European governments and Western governments, that they are in one way or another blaming on Russia. You know what I mean? Not necessarily blowing things up, but obviously like the energy crisis that we're going to, we supposedly have to expect over this winter, shortage of electricity and energy. European governments consciously chose to do that. They consciously chose to stop buying Russian gas and oil. So if there's any shortfall in that, it's their fault. But we're told that Putin did that to them. And we're meant to believe, like, if this winter, if you're freezing up in Germany because you can't buy any fuel or you can't afford it or whatever, or there's none available, that's Putin's fault. Despite the fact that the German government decided to shut off gas supply from Russia.
And
so there's so much stuff going on, you know, where they're... Yeah, go ahead.
And Putin went even so far that he destroyed his own pipelines.
Right. Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, yeah, probably. We're meant to believe that he blew them up himself. Yeah, so there's so much stuff going on where governments are doing things to their own citizens, to their own country, to their own industry, to their own economy, to their own population, and so in some way or another blaming someone else. So when some kind of sabotage is carried out on German train lines, we all take your pick. It was Russia, and it was Germany, and it was America, and it was Poland. All of them did it. I don't know. You know, somebody's doing it. You know, but yeah, this is. I thought this picture was pretty good. It's if you just make it bigger, there, Scotty, can you? Yeah, enlargeify it, or just do an expandy on the little. Yeah, there you go. So that's pretty much the height of it. So that's the truck was driving along, kind of in the picture there, left to right, I suppose. Unless I've got it backwards. Anyway, it was driving along. Yeah, left to right, and it destroyed. So that's a 2-lane highway. You can see it's kind of more or less separate, a 4-lane highway basically. So part of the 2-lane highway that was, I think that's the outbound one that the truck was actually on, or sorry, the inbound one the truck was on. It collapsed. I suppose the truck's at the bottom of the Kirch Street right now. Well, there's probably not much left of the truck actually.
Right.
But so it collapsed that section. What's that? Maybe, I don't know, a couple of 100 meters. But the other section there beside the collapsed part is open, so that just becomes a two-way, you know, single lane, two-way, back and forth. So the road is still open, the bridge is still open, and the railway above. That train, that's what we're saying about the train. The train actually, the truck explosion was activated. It was exploded as that train carrying a cargo of fuel in tanks was passing by. So that requires a certain level of awareness and planning and stuff. But that was was quickly extinguished. That train has been removed. The tracks aren't really damaged. The trains were running again, like you said, Sergey, within a few hours, and traffic is still running. So, and that'll be that section of highway that's in the ocean will be replaced within a couple of weeks. So, but they love it. You know, it's like you said, it's a propaganda. It's the fields. You know, yeah, we struck Putin on Putin's bridge.
Some emotional satisfaction.
Yeah, that's all it is. You know, it's emotional satisfaction. It's not about the truth or what's actually happening. It's what makes me feel good, basically. And everybody's doing that from the almost the high level politicians who are tweeting about it. They're all doing exactly the same thing. You know, it's just depressing that no one's interested in what's actually going on. But whatever, I'll just have to go it alone. Martyr the cause, yeah. So yeah, we promised to keep this one short today because we got to do other stuff. But do you have anything else you think is relevant to what's going on? I asked you for some predictions. You just said we'll just have to wait and see. You sure you don't want to double down on a prediction just to see if it happens? You want to say are there going to be any winners or losers? Or do you think it'll just grind to a halt? Well, you mentioned about the energy this winter, that it might, in a certain sense, kind of the most likely scenario might be that the energy, that's being input into the Ukrainian military and stuff, if that is withdrawn from European countries and from NATO basically, and European and the US, if other factors intervene to stop that flow of money and supplies to Ukraine, well then suddenly a chance for diplomacy arises, right?
Well, but I guess it will be too late
Yeah.
for any negotiations.
Well, there may be negotiations that are in Russia's favor at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll wait and see what happens. But we are going to leave it there for this week, folks. It's just a short one comparatively, although it's still over an hour. But yeah. So thanks, Sergey, for coming in and having a chat, and thanks for your insights. It was very interesting. Thanks to our chatters for chatting and commenting, etc., and for watching and listening, whatever you're doing. Don't forget to smash all the buttons. We'll be back next week with another show. So until then, have a good one. See you later.
See you.
Can't stop the signal now.